Drinking our calories is really one of the worst things you can do for your health, especially because so many of the beverages that are out there have a ton of added sugar. And so if we sat down and I poured you a glass of orange juice and I said, oh, I'd like you to drink this glass of orange juice, you would probably sit down and drink it in a minute, if that. But if we sat down and I gave you the number of oranges that are needed to produce that glass of orange juice, and I said, I want you to sit here, Resa, and peel these oranges and then eat them. Couldn't do it in a minute. When we have these beverages, they go down easy. We don't have the satiety signals kick in. We don't have the mastication of chewing the food, that sensation that contributes to the satiety process. We lose the fiber. We lose the other nutrients that are often taken out when you just juice something. And that is really one of the biggest pitfalls that comes along with drinking our calories.
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Nicole Avena. Nicole is a research neuroscientist and an author. She holds subject matter expertise in nutrition, diet, and addiction. Now, in case you're wondering what kind of addiction, the addiction we're talking about is sugar. Nicole is on the faculty at Mount Sinai School of Medicine and Princeton University. We speak all about sugar, sugar addiction, UPFs, that's ultra-processed foods, and specially designed content that talks all about gut health. Nicole first came on my radar thanks to a book that I read called Ultra-Processed People, The Science Behind Food That Isn't Food. Let's get to the conversation. I want to highlight a 2024 article that you published with a group of authors in Brain Science, and the title of that was Food Addiction. Why is this so controversial? Your science and your work really has made a link, the neural pathways that food addiction, sugar addiction is addiction, but there seems to be within the science community a pushback on that and a lack of people completely accepting that model.
You're very right. There's been pushback since the moment I started doing this research. And I remember being a grad student and putting out abstracts to present at conferences about my research and talking just internally to other professors about what I was working on. And a lot of people just didn't think that this was something worth studying. And they kind of thought it was silly. And I didn't really get a lot of support in it. And thank goodness for my advisor at the time, who was very grateful and very supportive of this project. In part, I think it's because this whole concept of addiction has been so on the opposite end of the spectrum compared to food. And when we started to talk about putting those two things together, I think it made people uncomfortable. And I remember getting pushback initially presenting this work at conferences where, people would say, well, you can't talk about food being addictive. That's insulting to people who have real addictions, like, drug addictions, for example. More recently, I think the pushback has certainly come from the food industry. I mean, this scientific discord, it's part of the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to not agree with every scientific thing that pops up. So in many ways, I'm grateful that there are some people who are, not on board with it, because I think that just encourages my lab and others to keep moving forward and producing more evidence that supports it.
Can you walk us through the neurotransmitters and the brain pathways that are parallel to, say, heroin or amphetamine addiction and what we see with sugar addiction?
Yeah, so when we first started doing these studies, the idea was to basically just think about any other addictive substance, like you say, heroin, nicotine, morphine, and just ask the question differently. Can sugar do that? Can sugar meet these criteria? Can sugar affect the brain in that way? And so that's essentially what we started doing research studies in the lab and animal models, and then also clinical studies, really just asking that question, can sugar produce these signs of addiction? And what we were able to see is that in terms of the brain, it releases dopamine in the reward-related regions of the brain. That's one of the hallmarks of drug addiction. That's why they can be so addictive for some individuals. And what we found with sugar is that it can do the same thing. And normally food can't do that. When you eat a food, if it's something that you've had in the past, normally it doesn't release dopamine. But what we find with sugar is it's very different in that it can. And I think that's what makes it different than many of these other types of foods that we tend to overeat. And when we take a look at our modern food environment and all these processed foods, The common denominator is the added sugar. And we're seeing amounts of added sugar in our foods that we've never seen in the history of our being. I really want people to acknowledge the struggle that we've had to go through. And it's not just me. There's other researchers who've been studying this for years and years and have really worked hard to produce this research and publish these papers and get this information out there. Take a look at what happens when people are dependent on nicotine, for example, if they're smoking cigarettes. When people go into nicotine withdrawal, it's not life-threatening. It's uncomfortable. They're irritable. They might have a headache. They might not be fun to be around. And it very much looks like what happens when people are in sugar withdrawal. Early in January every year, we get a lot of this, right? When people make those New Year's resolutions and they say, okay, I'm going to cut out sugar. I'm going to eat healthy. And what happens a couple days into it, they start to feel lethargic and they have headaches and they're irritable and cranky. And a lot of people think, oh, my blood sugar must be dropping because I haven't had enough sugar. But in reality, that's the withdrawal. And we've been able to publish on that and show that, in fact, signs of withdrawal emerge in response to giving up sugar, just like signs of withdrawal emerge when people give up other drugs like nicotine or morphine or alcohol.
You've talked about there are actually brain changes that occur with addiction to sugar when our brains are growing and developing, i.e., children and adolescents. What have you found regarding sugar and brain development?
We've been interested in not only what happens when someone becomes dependent on sugar or becomes addicted and how that affects the brain. And we know there's a whole host of changes that happen, not only in terms of the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine, but also in the receptor availability, in the DNA for those neurotransmitters. We've been looking at really early life, and a lot of that can happen even during pregnancy, and exposure to these different types of highly palatable foods and ultra processed foods during pregnancy can have a significant impact on the offspring. And we and others have shown that not only can there be changes in the development of the dopamine system, but also in the gene expression for those dopamine neurons. And what this means is that basically the brain is developing in a way that is different because of its exposure to these highly processed foods. And that's setting kids up potentially for trouble later on in terms of having a proclivity to like those types of foods, having altered brain mechanisms that perhaps put them at risk for developing other types of addictions. Like, for example, in some of our studies, we've shown increased risk for alcohol use, increased risk for amphetamine sensitivity, and really just a different brain. And I think that that's important to understand, because when we're talking about the developing brain, that critical window during pregnancy and early life, changes that are happening then, they can be hard to change back later on in life.
You've done some really interesting work in looking at sugar and then in artificial sweeteners. And so for listeners, audience members that are wondering, is there a difference? Does the brain know the difference between sugar, honey, agave, maple syrup, all the different kind of sweeteners that they think might be natural and actually, quote, better for us?
Well, the short answer is that no, the brain doesn't know the difference. Our brain is expecting things to taste sweet, and it doesn't know that there's synthetic sweeteners out there. It doesn't know that there's artificial sweeteners out there. Sweet is sweet. And what happens is that these sweet tastes, regardless of whether or not it has calories, regardless of if it comes from an agave plant or it's from a more natural form or whatever the marketing might tell you about it, it still affects the brain in the same way. It's still releasing dopamine. It's still causing your brain to experience this pleasurable sensation. Some of these other sweeteners, for example, ones that don't have calories or have lower calories, or maybe other sweeteners that don't affect our blood glucose levels the same, there could be differences in those ways. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at the addiction, the desire, the craving, the wanting to consume more and more of it, all of these sweeteners are the same in terms of how they're affecting the brain.
What is the problem with eating so much sugar, be it natural, be it synthetic, in terms of chronic diseases?
When I first started doing this research, the big problem that people were talking about was obesity. And back in 2001, there were starting to be a lot more concern about obesity as a public health issue. More and more people were being considered as having obesity. And at that time, it was a concern, but it was really a concern more so because individuals were thought that it was their fault. If you don't have the ability to control what you're eating, well, that's on you. You need to have more self-control. And that was kind of the advice that was being given at the time. And I personally thought that that didn't make a lot of sense because there's plenty of diet programs out there, all this wonderful advice, and people try to follow it, but they can't because they just feel so compelled to eat these certain types of foods. And so that's where this idea that maybe these foods are addictive came in. And if we know that these foods can be addictive and we know that eating too much of them can increase body weight, that it can lead to obesity, it can lead to all of these comorbid health conditions that can come along with obesity, like heart disease, increased risk for certain cancers, increased risk for developing diabetes. Too much added sugar has been linked to effects on mental health, our ability to focus and concentrate. I mean, anyone who has little kids knows that you give your kid a bowl of cereal and then put them on the school bus, the teacher does not like you and you are not making friends at the school because it really just affects their behavior. And so what started off as perhaps being concerned that people were going to be overweight also has led to these additional concerns about these medical complications that can come along with obesity, but also that can come along without obesity.
You and your work came across my radar thanks to a book called Ultra Processed People. And then I started doing the deep dive into the medical and scientific literature. I want to say it like that, the literature. You've had many PubMed publications, scientific publications, but also you've clearly felt the importance of publishing in non-academic outlets. In fact, your paperback book of Sugarless is now out. Why is it important to make sure that we're publishing not just in scientific outlets, but also in more mainstream outlets?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So when I first started doing this research, I was a grad student at Princeton doing my PhD in neuroscience. And the advice I was given by my mentors was scientists belong in the lab. We're not science journalists, we're scientists. We're doing studies and we're publishing them in peer-reviewed academic papers. We're publishing them in textbooks. We're presenting at conferences. Leave the reporting to the reporters. And I kind of bought into that a bit, but then I started to get a little bit disheartened because at some point early in my career, a couple of our papers had gotten some attention in the media, and the reporters, by no fault of their own, because obviously they're not scientists, they got it wrong. They kind of mixed up the results and they overstated the findings. And as a scientist who's, trained to be very careful about the way in which we interpret things, I got upset by that. And so I thought it'd be really nice to take the middleman out and have more scientists directly involved with the actual reporting of the science. And so that's when I kind of decided to go against what my advisors had sort of been suggesting and talk to the media and get more involved with making sure that people got the science right and taking the time, to help writers and people who were doing articles understand the science. And that kind of led into this whole idea that maybe we should have more scientists actually in the media doing this and talking about the work, because we know it firsthand. We've lived it. Many of us have been in the trenches and can really understand it in a way that can be helpful for other people out there when we're trying to explain it. So that's what made me want to become more of a science communicator. And so it kind of led me down the path of, doing TV media segments and articles and writing books and really helping people that don't have a science background to understand the research, because it's important. And it's not just for my research, it's for all research, all science. I think we need to have more scientists involved in the process and helping people really to understand, what goes into these studies, because there are so many articles that are published every day. And there's so much out there in terms of publications that it can almost be hard to evaluate what's a good publication from a bad one. And so I think having scientists involved in that process is really critical.
I want to tap into another piece of the science that you've studied, and it's the concept of satiety, feeling full. From what I've read in my study of lifestyle medicine, behavior changes, eating, food as medicine, we should eat until we're about 80% full, not 100%, 80%. But realizing that 80% full requires eating at a pace that you can actually appreciate that you are 80% full. In other words, it takes 20 minutes from our gut to our brain to realize, oh, there's a lot of food in my stomach. And so how would you advise listeners to think about the pace and the speed at which they eat?
We are in a world these days where everything is rushed. We're eating in our cars. We're getting stuff to go and eating it on the way. You get a coffee and it's very rarely given to you in a mug. You get it in a to-go cup because you got to go, right? We're always on to the next thing. And I think that's one of the worst things that we can do for our health in terms of nutrition and being able to understand our satiety signals. Our body needs time to process when we eat or drink something, when we feel satisfied, when we feel full, when we feel like we've had enough. And when we're constantly rushing and moving on to the next thing and not paying attention to what we're actually doing when we're eating, those signals can get lost. Another thing that I think people need to be mindful of, in addition to slowing down and making the time to sit down and eat or sit down and have your beverage, is also ignoring the portion sizes. I think this is a really big piece of noise that comes in because psychologically, when we see a plate of food, we think that's what we're supposed to eat. But in reality, it's probably twice as much. And that's why I often recommend if people go out to a restaurant or, especially if you're with multiple people, either sharing a plate or asking for a to-go container as soon as you get your meal so you can put half of it away and to take it home, because really the portions have really distorted what we think we should be eating. And that's what leads a lot of people to overeating.
I want to end by speaking a bit about what we drink. People think they're drinking orange juice, they're drinking apple juice, that this is good for them. But, there's a lot out there to say you should be eating the orange or eating the apple, not drinking the apple juice, drinking the orange juice. I'm wondering if you can say more about thinking about what we drink and where sugars can be hidden.
Drinking our calories is really one of the worst things you can do for your health, especially because so many of the beverages that are out there have a ton of added sugar. And so if we sat down and I poured you a glass of orange juice and I said, I'd like you to drink this glass of orange juice, you would probably sit down and drink it in a minute, if that. But if we sat down and I gave you the number of oranges that are needed to produce that glass of orange juice, and I said, I want you to sit here, Resa, and peel these oranges and then eat them, definitely couldn't do it in a minute. When we have these beverages, they go down easy. We don't have the satiety signals kick in. We don't have the mastication of chewing the food, that sensation that contributes to the satiety process. We lose fiber. We lose the other nutrients that are often taken out when you just juice something. And that is really one of the biggest pitfalls that comes along with drinking our calories. I really recommend that if you want to have, a piece of fruit and you don't have time to sit there and chew it, then go ahead and stick it in the blender, but put the whole thing in there. Don't just take the juice, because the juice is really just the sugar.
The Resa wrap-up. Well, 3 take-home points for you, audience, and thanks to Dr. Nicole Avena for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast. Number 1, sugar addiction. It's real. The science, the research, and addiction specialists support this. You are not imagining it when your cravings and your symptoms seem to mimic withdrawal. Next, check out Nicole's book, which just dropped in paperback, Sugarless, a 7-step plan to uncover hidden sugars, curb your cravings, and conquer your addiction. Finally, I'd like you to do some self-reflection and raise your awareness of your own relationship to sugar, the foods that you're eating, the drinks you're drinking, and how much sugar really are in those substances. Start reading labels and select products where you can pronounce the words. In other words, try to avoid all the sugar. That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Please find me through my website and on social media, Resa E. Lewis, MD, or through the podcast, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please be sure to share the show with a friend. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the institution with which they are affiliated or identified. Information herein should never be used as a substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice.